Mhm. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this. I feel it's a special webinar. Okay, so this presentation, Misha presented at the CTBUH conference in Chicago in the fall, and we got a lot of requests. It had this very, I guess, attractive title. So we got a lot of requests to present it on one of our webinars. So here it is. Misha is an architect and urban designer and co-founder of Smart Density. And Misha, take it from here and please type your questions in the chat.
Great, thank you, Nama. I'll need to be able to share the screen.
Go for it.
Okay. Okay, do you see it okay? Nama?
Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Yeah, so hi everyone, thanks Nama. So what we're going to talk about today is neighborhoods that look like this, like what you see in the background. It's large master plan developments where the main type of building is point towers. And this is something that became common in the last couple of decades. So tall neighborhoods on their own are not something new, but in the past, until maybe 30, 40 years ago, we usually had buildings of 15 to 20 stories, sometimes slab form. So what's different now is that now we have neighborhoods of point towers that are between 15 and sometimes up to 50 stories. And it's a type of neighborhood that's being built on quite a massive scale all over the world. And so for us in Smart Density, master planning of neighborhoods has been a growing part of our portfolio. So naturally, this phenomenon is something that's very interesting for us. But at the same time that it's interesting as a curiosity, these neighborhoods, the way they're designed today, have some serious problems. So considering the massive scale at which they're being developed, it is concerning. So the structure of the presentation will be simple. We'll discuss what these neighborhoods are, why they are so common, and why they underperform, and how we can improve them. So we will present the main existing approaches and a new approach that we've been developing. So to kind of put it simply in a way of contrast, we're not talking about this. So we're not talking about something right at the city center. We're not talking about situations where every building has a unique design. We're not talking about very tall towers of 60, 70, 100 stories. We're talking about quite the opposite. So not the center, kind of in between the center and the periphery of the metropolitan area. Usually simple towers with repetitive designs. And building heights are between 15 and the highest will be about maybe 50 stories. And it's really driven more by economics and development, simple development considerations rather than prestige, so they're usually not that high. So let's do a little tour around the world to see what we're talking about. So this is in Israel. It's a very common type of development there. So what we see, we have these freestanding residential towers. In this case, they are between 25 and 35 stories. Very low building coverage, maybe only about 10%, and also like the towers are the only buildings pretty much. And we see there is a very large amount of surface parking, some large landscaped areas, but yeah, generally the towers is the only building type. This is in China, in Beijing. It's also, this development type is also very common in China. Here the height is around 35 stories. And this is also in China, in Chengdu. By the way, if you visit China, I highly recommend it to visit there. And this is probably the highest form of this neighborhood we've seen, which is about getting up to 50 stories. This is in South Korea, where it's also extremely common. So you can see that there are differences, of course, in details, but the general organization and the feel, at least from the air, is generally similar. Another one in South Korea, also note just the scale of some of those. Now let's go through a few areas of the world where these things exist, these tall neighborhoods exist, but they're not that common, at least yet. So this is in Kiev. This is from about 10 years ago. It's not a Soviet era development, about 25 stories. It's not very common in Europe in general. There are some in Eastern Europe, though to some extent it's not getting more common there. But in other places it is. So this is in Ethiopia, and it's only the buildings here, towers here are only 13 stories, so they're also much closer to each other. But in other parts of the world, usually they also were relatively low at the beginning. So it's not very common in Africa yet, but there are some of them, and there will probably be more as capital and demand for density become more prevalent. And this is in Ahmedabad in India. Also here too, it's about 14 stories, so still they're close to each other. It's not very common in South Asia yet, but there are more of them, and there likely will be more as well. So what are the characteristics that we've seen? So we have the point towers, we have low building coverage, and we have these staggered layouts of tower locations to maximize the distance, the views between them. So why are they so common? So there is something we're all familiar with. There is increasing pressure for high density development in many places in the world. Point towers make it very easy to achieve daylighting, ventilation, and views. The site design is simple. It's just locating the towers and then connecting by infrastructure. But the most important factor is that in the last couple of decades, towers, simple residential towers have become pretty much competitive per unit area with mid-rise buildings. So I'm not talking about some of the higher forms we've seen, like 50 stories, but for the 20, 30, 35 stories range, they're comparable. So with all these other advantages, it really makes the development decision simple to go with this approach. So what is missing in these places? So in a few slides, we'll go back and look at some of the development we showed, look at them from the street level. And what we'll see is that they're missing pretty much any kind of real urban experience. So they don't have places where you can be. They don't have places where you really want to stay. They don't take advantage of the high density to make really something attractive out of it. And they lack really this simple, relatively simple, but very important places for community and for enjoying the city. And then just to clarify, I'm not talking just about the commercial type of experience or in sitting in a coffee shop, but there aren't really enjoyable or well-defined residential areas. So as we go through the next images, think what kind of experience there is in these places. So this is that development we've seen in Kiev. Oh, note we're actually looking at a landscaped area, but there's so much landscaping. There's not much to do with it. So there's not much to it. And here it's the surface parking, very dominant in these places. This is back in Israel, again, very car dominant. So it's technically, of course, walkable. There are sidewalks. There is even a bike path here, but it's not really a place where you're going to want to be walking very much. Even a somewhat wider street in the same development. And this is what we've seen in Ahmedabad in India. So the street feels maybe a bit more defined and closed, but fundamentally you're walking with the road on one side, and what you can see here, that wall behind which there is more surface parking. So not really much to, and not a very attractive environment. So why these places underperform? So there aren't really defined places in them. It's pretty much comprised of continuous landscaping, open space, very wide streets. There is little activity. It's mostly residential, so that's one reason, but it's also, there isn't really much place for things to happen. And they are dominated by cars, both by visually, just by safety-wise, by the moving cars and by these large surface parking lots. And I guess the next question is why they are designed in this way. And there are two reasons. So one of them is the technical one. So there is a need for large separation between tall buildings, especially in this range of height. And the simple ways to accommodate that is by just putting nothing between them, leaving it empty. But there is another reason, and that's that a lot of this is led by the concept or vision of towers in a park, which is a very outdated, 100 years old vision of modernity. So this is a conceptual plan by modernist architect Le Corbusier for Paris, of all places, which is showing the towers in a park concept. And the idea was that by concentrating density in towers, you can free up the space at grade for open space, which contrasted it with the very busy cities at the time, of which there was a lot of criticism. But practically, whenever it was implemented, it usually ended up as towers in a parking lot, which is a common term to criticize them. And that's because, A, there was an increasing demand for parking, but also there wasn't really much to do with all that open space. So that's what there was to it eventually. So even though this approach was to a large extent discredited, especially in the West, it's still unfortunately somehow a vision of the future in many parts of the world. So it is in part a driving force for some development. So then how can we achieve vibrant neighborhoods? So I'm putting it here to clarify up front that we're not discussing here the European solution for high density, which is to use mid-rise almost exclusively. It's a good solution, but even though this idea of high density through mid-rise was pushed a lot by urbanists in the last couple of decades, it never really took off anywhere outside of some parts of Europe. And Europe is also pretty much the only place where they have really extensive historic precedent and historic experience with these neighborhoods. Europe is also unique in the world in having a very low growth rate and a planning system that is quite different from other places, and that allows to really control the development on a very massive scale of the metropolitan area. But also there is the aspect that the tall buildings do have a lot of advantages that we do want to use, and we don't want to lose them. So we will now really focus on solutions that are for tall neighborhoods. So there are two main approaches that we identified for how to make these tall neighborhoods nicer and better. So one of them is what I call towers in an actual park, which fundamentally are approaches that take the original idea of towers in the park and actually implement it successfully, which hasn't really happened until maybe 20 years ago. And the other approach, so the first approach is pretty common to East Asia, and the second is mainly North American and even specifically Canadian. It's the tower and podium approach, or somewhat synonymous with Vancouverism. So let's start with the first one. So this approach solves the kind of addresses the issues by adding quality to the open space. And again, all mainly exists in East Asia. So this is Helios City in Seoul, in South Korea. It was, at least at the time, the largest residential development in the country. And from the air, it's not very different from what we've seen before in terms of the arrangements, the freestanding towers. But where it's different is the treatment of the ground. So what they are doing here and in many other developments of this type in the country and in some places in China, is that they pushed all the servicing, especially the parking, loading access. They put it underground on a massive and connected parking lot. And they do treat with care the open areas between the buildings to create this kind of really attractive and differentiated environment and have this park-like atmosphere, which is a huge improvement. So again, this is facilitated by the huge parking lots. Another development in South Korea with somewhat differs in the landscaping, the towers, but fundamentally the same ideas. As I mentioned, it's also common in China, but because we don't have access to Google Street View there, we were a little limited in showing that in this presentation, but you just be aware that it's common there as well. So what it solves is that it eliminates these huge undifferentiated endless spaces, and it reduces the presence of cars, but it still doesn't really achieve urban vibrancy. It's all kind of spread out. It's expensive because of the very large amount of open space. It's expensive to build, it's expensive to maintain. There are also safety concerns because such a huge open space can't be really effectively overlooked by windows or people walking by, so a lot of kind of dead areas. So let's move to the second approach, the tower and podium or Vancouverism, which is mainly about bringing streets back to become part of neighborhoods and tall neighborhoods in this sense. So what they do is they use low and mid-rise podiums to create a relatable human scale at grade and define streets, open spaces. And again, it's been implemented in a few places around the world, but Canada is really the only place where it's being implemented on a relatively significant scale. And this is how it looks like. I would note that this is like the city of Vancouver. It differs from what we've seen before because this is not a master plan community. It's a city street where this scheme was implemented based on intensification and redevelopment policy, but you get the idea. We have this, we have towers, we see there. We also have the low-rise, in this case, townhouses. So it creates a defined street. It's definitely not the greatest street in the world. It's okay. It's pretty typical to many of our cities, also in outside of a high-rise context. This is also in a British Columbia, similar concept, a bit more commercial. Well, you see how it does have this kind of low-rise street edge, and like still, it's not a great street, but has potential. And this is City Place in Toronto. It's the first, I think it's the first development of this kind in the Toronto region. It's a large master plan community that was developed over about 20 years. And the main difference from the British Columbia examples is that here the podiums are more on the mid-rise scale. So this is how the streets, the local streets look like. And this is when this kind of more of a collector road, which also function as a semi-commercial spine. It's not. It's better than approaches that existed at the time, but since it's not like the greatest place, I would also, to be honest, also the images are not providing like the most attractive representation, and like when there are more people, it does look nicer in reality. So for this scheme, so it does bring back well-defined streets and open spaces, and it can be vibrant, though it's far from guaranteed. And the use of podiums does bring back some human scale, but streets and open spaces are still usually oversized. And because it's comprised of pretty large blocks, every street has to provide car access. So what we end up with is that the main experience is that you are on this relatively big street with cars, and that kind of, that's the neighborhood look and feel. So this is, so we'll discuss shortly our proposal for a different approach, which we ask ourselves when working on developments here, how we can do better. And fundamentally, we think the main thing is that we need to break the connection between the height of the tall buildings and the scale of the neighborhood. So the fact that the buildings are tall doesn't mean that everything else also has to be big. For now, we called it provisionally scaling down. And it is in part about bringing charm back to neighborhoods. After having brought back the streets with the previous scheme, we go farther. And the idea is that we take the basics from the tower and podium approach and improve upon it by bringing everything to the human scale. So buildings, streets, open spaces. This is a project we've been working on in the Greater Toronto area near a planned, it's a future transit station. So on the left, you can see figure ground plans. On the top is another development in the region that is quite typical to the podium and tower scheme in an intensification area. It has comparable density. It also has point towers. And you notice the difference at the bottom is this development. You see the difference in size of the blocks, the size of the streets. And now if you look at the plan, you see that like in white, you see the point towers. It's the same general arrangement that we've seen before, and it's still fundamentally podium and tower arrangement. But what's different is that everything is scaled down. So the kind of place you experience when you're at grade is different. And because the blocks are smaller and it allows you to have more streets, so not every street has to function for moving cars. So we still have the streets that move cars. Of course, we're able to shrink them a bit as well to bring them to more manageable and pleasant size. But we also have shared streets where cars enter at very low speeds. And we have some streets that can be completely car-free and much closer to the human scale. And you can see the kind of atmosphere we're aiming at. And also, of course, in terms of safety, like, for example, you can have your bike routes completely separated from traffic, except for when you're crossing the road and you're not riding next to cars. So this completely changes the experience of being in a neighborhood because the scale and the proximity to the building and the consistent presence of cars is different. So this is a 3D view of the proposals, and so it shows how, you know, the tall buildings are there, they're visible, they're present, but they don't define the scale of the experience in the neighborhood. By the way, thanks to making the streets more compact, we also able to make the open spaces more compact, so we can have more variety. We can have more of them that are smaller but more concentrated. It doesn't have to all be one grassy park. There is variety in the experience. So you get the idea. So just kind of to summarize, so master plan tall neighborhoods are being built on a massive scale around the world. And the standard design, which is the pretty much towers in the parking lot, what we discussed at the beginning, is really severely lacking. So making that one better is a critical challenge to undertake. And we discussed the two main approaches that we identified and kind of named them. One was about making actual towers in the park, and the other was the podium and tower, but they typically do still leave a lot to be desired. And we presented or hinted at an approach that we proposed that uses traditional urban design techniques, and applies them to tall neighborhoods to make them more vibrant, more pleasant, more successful. That's it. Thank you. I invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. And I'm just leaving this as a teaser for something that Nama will present that definitely has a relation to tall neighborhoods.
Thank you, Misha. Okay, so let's get started with the questions, and please feel free to type some of your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A. So, Misha, let's get started. How, you know, we're still pretty early with that master plan. What do you think will be our greatest challenge in the way to implement this very exciting vision?
I think there are two main challenges. One of them is not a challenge that is not the major challenge here, but the major challenge in general that even in the development community, there is a certain set of expectations of how things are supposed to be, and certain standards, and the knowledge that when you do anything differently, it means that there is there's more time, there's more, at least more work to internally with the municipality, even though the client here is very supportive on making new things and making great things. But I think the major concern is more about municipalities and or regions and government in general, and the expectations they have, and the difficulty of working outside of specific standards. So I would say that is the major challenge in this kind of approaches. You're muted, Nama.
Sorry, I muted myself. I'm sorry. How do you factor in safety level for smaller alleys in this development? So I'll just take a quick answer to reply that, a quick chance. Where these are not alleys. These are just narrower than the typical ridiculously wide streets that we assume we need in new developments. So now, Misha, I'll let you answer, but I just had to give
yeah, no, it pretty much, I think what you said covers it pretty much. It's not, first of all, actually in this specific development, there aren't there is small amount of laneways, but they're not really a dominant feature, and there isn't really a safety concern because you pretty much see through them. But I think safety, a lot of it is about visibility. So there are the concerns. There are places where you're walking on a very wide streets, but you're surrounded by blank walls and people barely go by. And these places feel and are in practice much more dangerous than a much narrower street. So if you go to Europe or some older cities across the world, also in North America, we're talking about fundamentally about streets. We're not talking. It doesn't. When you're in a place that is a street, it doesn't matter that it's well, not maybe in our proposal here, but it doesn't matter even if it's 4 meters wide, as you have in some older cities in Europe. It doesn't make them dangerous because they're surrounded by buildings, they're overlooked by buildings, people pass by, so it's not really a concern for this type of places.
Totally. Okay. Can you speak to the role of mobility and transit in this approach?
So I would say on the high level, I think generally just the justification for high density is like let's say regional level of access, as in being on major transit or being able to connect to centers in the city. But on the more local level, in terms of soft mobility of walking, cycling, and like other modes like that, I think for us it was a very important aspect. And the big improvement, we haven't discussed it a lot when presenting, but the big improvement is that your main routes for walking and cycling can be completely separate from car traffic. So I mean, occasionally you will need to cross a road, of course, but you're not walking next to, and especially cycling next to cars on the time. So in terms of safety and the quality of the experience, it's much better. I hope I answered the question.
What are your thoughts on the urbanism of Central Park in New York on a smaller scale, meaning one large park with many different uses inside, surrounded by tall buildings with retail at grades versus towers scattered over large area? So I also want to take a chance to answer that. One of the things that we hear from clients actually is that once you have this really big park as part of the master plan, it is usually delivered at a much later phase. Sometimes phases could be 20 years apart from each other. So what are you telling buyers? Yes, there's going to be a great park here in 20 years. So our approach of like phasing, like the scaling down of open space, that it solves you the problem of phasing. Misha, anything else that you would like to mention on the once big park approach?
Yeah, I think that there is in a city there is place for every scale of park. It's not about eliminating the larger scales of altogether. But fundamentally, you want there should be a gradient. There should be only a few very large parks in a city because they have a special function and they draw people from large distances. But the problem is that it's both about scale. Like typically you would see these developments just very large parks, and one of the reasons is that they're usually the scale of the park is driven by the scale of the buildings in general. And the other problem is that they usually have it's only one type of space. So in some ways, you could say that maybe what we presented is almost extreme, even though we don't think that's the case. But definitely having both, in many cases, taking the typical size of a park and spreading it a little, making it closer to places, having places of different qualities brings a lot of value to a neighborhood.
To what extent does the master plan take into account the requirement of retail or retailers? Visibility through traffic. Most retailers cannot survive from the master plan residential demand alone.
I think the question of amount of retail is always very important. In higher density developments, which is pretty much all the neighborhoods we've been showing here, there is some local demand, and a lot of it is also about continuity. So if you have one node of high density surrounded by low density, maybe it doesn't have enough density to generate the demand. But if the master, like if your community is large, or there are like a series of neighborhoods that together they can form that demand. One of the things, by the way, we've done here is that our commercial street is indeed car free, but it is a major bike thoroughfare, so it gets a lot of exposure from that as well. And of course, you can also, like, there are crossing roads that where you can see it from there. So you do enjoy this. You still enjoy this exposure.
There's a question I think we're both going to really like. How are you incorporating, ensuring a mixture of uses that is a complete neighborhood, making sure you get the places and spaces for kids, flexibility for users over time? So, Misha, do you want to tell Becky how we called a principle in this master plan?
I don't remember how we called it. I can
the
tell
free range kids. What do you mean?
Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah. No. Okay. Yeah. That is an aspect. Yeah. That is an aspect where we did have a principle we called free range kids, which is like, free range chickens and eggs. So maybe I don't know to what extent we're going to stick with that one. But the idea is that you have large areas that are are either completely free of car traffic, like fast moving cars. Okay, so maybe you have some very slow traffic where you can if you have a young you define it by, if you have a young child that can run 50 meters away from you, you're still not panicking out immediately because it's still a very safe space. But in terms of general flexibility, one of the the approach is, of course, it's mixed use. And we specifically here, we've been trying to incorporate flexibility in a few levels, but one of them, which I'll give an example of, is that many of the grade-related units have a ground floor that is flexible and can be used as either part of a, for example, townhouse unit, or it can be a separate unit, or it can be a commercial or community use. So even on the level of built form, there is like built-in flexibility. But there are many strategies of that of course, can be incorporated in different types of developments as well, not necessarily, not specific necessarily to this approach.
Misha, we have 20 more questions, and we try to keep our webinars short and with the 30-minute cap, because we know how busy your day is probably. So we will post more content on this, and this is our general approach, right? It's not just one master plan. This is our approach that we bring to any project that we work on. But that was kind of a unique opportunity to present. So for all the 20 questions that we didn't get to answer, I apologize, but please connect with us on LinkedIn and continue watching our webinars. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. Misha, thank you. That was, we had hundreds of people joining us today. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day. See you next time. Bye.